back to resurrect. Now, pretty early on in my rebuilding of salvage cars, out of necessity, I realized that I would have to start buying parts cars, mainly because some of these parts might be too hard to find at the time, or the parts were just way too expensive. And early on, I realized that actually just parting these cars and selling the parts sometimes can net you more profit than had I fixed the vehicle up and tried to sell it as a whole car. So in this video, that's exactly what I did. I picked up a vehicle with no intention of rebuilding, but actually I'm just going to take this car, break it down into parts, and sell parts for profit and try to get my money back that way. So in this particular instance, this car was missing a wheel, and that can be kind of a challenge when you're receiving a car to your garage, a home-based garage or a home-based workshop. So some tips and tricks on that is, and this car was out of state as well. So what you can do is call your local, let's say you get it from Copart in another state, you can call your local Copart and ask them if you can have that vehicle transported to the local auction, and from there they can fork that car onto your trailer. So you definitely would need some type of trailer to do this. And in my instance, I bought it from Insurance Auto Auctions from another state, and I asked my local Insurance Auto Auctions, and they are not very helpful. They never really have been, and they just refuse to help me in this manner. So what I had to do was call a friend who had a forklift, and he was able to receive the car and move it onto my trailer. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I process these cars, how I break them down, how I list the parts, where I list the parts, give you some ideas approximately what you can net from doing this. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe and like, comment below. Let's get right on into this video. Recently, I purchased a 2010 E63 AMG for parts only. German cars, especially BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, and some Audis, are great parts cars because most of the parts have part numbers listed on them. All you have to do is search eBay with this part number and find a good listing. Then click on sell an item like this, upload your own photos, and 30 seconds later, the listing is set. I have an eBay store, and I'll usually part 1 to 2 cars a year, and that's depending if I find the right deal, and it'll usually take a week or two of my time, but it usually will net me about $10,000 or $15,000 a year. It's not glamorous work, and it's not as fulfilling as bringing a car back to life, but it's quicker money than rebuilding, less labor, less risk, and you really get to know your way around a car when you tear it down to a bare chassis. I found this car at an Insurance Auto Auctions listing late at night with a buy it now for $5,000. Having parted a few AMG cars in the past, I fully knew the value of the engine alone was worth it to justify this amount. Also, there are many parts on AMG cars that are exclusive and harder to find, which can bring a premium dollar. I like to keep my store stocked with at least 200 items, and I typically sell parts that are worth more than maybe $50. Most parts that are worth less than this, or maybe they're just kind of awkward size or expensive to ship, are just not worth listing and usually end up in a dumpster or in the scrap. So many parts are just not worth your time. But the brakes, the engine, the transmission, the differential, electrical modules, and some of the interior parts on this car are gold and are certainly worth hanging on to. Selling parts is a slow process, but typically my money will come back to me within 3 to 6 months, and by month 6 to 9, I usually start turning a profit. It's not a gravy train, but it pays the bills, and I find it satisfying in a weird way. So we get started by pulling the car into the garage on my trailer in between the lift posts. One of the wheels on this car was completely ripped off, so we're going to have to lift the car off of the trailer. Using an air jack and some wooden blocks as well as some car ramps as a safety, I'm able to prop the car high enough to swing the lift arms underneath the car. Doing things very slowly, carefully and calculated, because it would be easy to make a mistake and have the car fall off the lift. So once the car is on all 4 arms, I drive the trailer out from under the car. The first thing I usually do is get the car cleaned out. I don't like working around other people's car garbage or broken glass at the same time. That's a recipe for an infected wound. So once I get the car cleaned out, my next goal is to figure out if the engine is good and the mechanicals. So I need to move some stuff out of the way and bend the frame back just a little so I can access some of the parts in the front. I had to order a key from Mercedes, which cost me $240. A few mobile locksmiths quoted me $350 to make this key. I prefer the dealer because obviously it's cheaper, and they made the key just by me giving them the VIN number and proof of ownership. So within 2 to 3 business days, the key was made and ready for pickup. After getting the key, I checked the engine oil and the coolant before cranking the engine. And I always like to turn the engine by hand or with the starter before firing up the engine to get the oil circulating a little. The radiator on this car was damaged, so I just bought a universal, flexible radiator hose from the auto parts store and made a closed loop in and out of the engine and just topped it off with tap water for testing purposes only. Also on this car, and many other modern cars, when the airbags blow, there's usually some type of pyrotechnic fuse that will separate the power to the starter, or sometimes the fuel pump. This car breaks power to the starter, so I use a regular set of jumper cables to bypass this fuse. I also had to trim several damaged wires in the front of the car that were shorted, and I had to replace a couple fuses that supplied power to the engine control unit. Once I took care of all of these hurdles, the engine fired up right away and it sounded perfect. This engine only has 64,000 miles on it, so it is a valuable piece. Now it's time to remove all the fluids in the car and start disassembly. Another thing that you should never forget to do is to loosen up the bolts for the front seats, roll up the windows, close the sunroof, and lower any sunshades in the car, because once you pull the electronics out of the car and you disconnect the battery, you're going to have a heck of a time dealing with this later. First step is getting the exhaust out of the car and several underbody panels, and then the drive shaft. Then I start working on removing the wheel liners and disconnecting everything in those areas, including the strut top mounting nuts, the brake lines, and the sensor wires. I like to use Ziploc bags on the brake lines because they will drip for quite a while once they're disconnected, and they will make a huge mess. Then I pulled the ECU. This part sold with the key and the ignition switch is worth some money as well. Now we're going to get this lift table in place so we can lower the engine and the transmission together with the subframe, suspension, and brakes. Now I start removing the brakes and the suspension from the front subframe and work on separating the engine from the transmission. In the trunk space, there are several valuable electronics to pull, and now we're working on removing the rear end and lowering it onto my toolbox. Now we pull the brakes and the differential, which are valuable parts, and we pretty much have a stripped chassis on the outside at this point. Lastly, I need to remove this fuel tank and the fuel pump. The fuel pump on this car is worth some coin, as well as the tank. Now I lower the chassis onto some skates and I rig it up with some lumber. And normally I would lower the car back onto my trailer and dispose of it at that point, but I have recently acquired a forklift, so I'm going to just move the body behind the fence for now. We're going to leave the interior in the cabin because I don't have a lot of storage space. Alright, so if you made it all the way to the end of this video, I just want to thank you for watching. I'm working on some updates for the Ferrari build, and I'm also working on several other videos that deal with buying and selling salvage vehicles. So stay tuned for that. Follow me on Instagram under Resurrect for all the in-between stuff. And thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.